Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon, and I'm the CEO for the Center for American Progress. I'm excited to welcome you to today's event. We are really excited about the lineup we have for the event, and think this is just a significant and crucial issue in the lives of Americans. I think, our political system, our politics talks a lot about affordability. And affordability is a real challenge. We do have a cost of living crisis in the country, but we also want to focus on the flip side of affordability, which is what workers are earning. The fact is that Americans feel really squeezed, and they feel squeezed between the higher cost of goods that they're experiencing every day and the paycheck that they are getting. And when it comes to what we can do about that paycheck, really the first step is addressing the federal minimum wage. I think everyone knows that the federal minimum wage is stuck at $7.25 and has been stuck since 2009. It is the longest we've gone without raising it since the creation of the minimum wage. And that really means that the minimum wage is really just doing less and less to bring wages up in the country. In the 17 years since the federal minimum wage was last raised, the cost of housing, groceries, childcare, and really everything has gone up. Prices are more than 50% higher than they were in 2009, and yet the wage floor hasn't moved an inch. Tens of millions of workers between tens of millions of workers make between $7.25 and $15 an hour, even after the wage compression of the Biden years. That's not enough to raise a family, go to school, or buy a house or nearly anywhere in America. So we are very far from a livable wage in many parts of the countries. And, I think we should all acknowledge that in the face of federal inaction, communities across the country are refusing to wait. States and cities are passing their own laws, like raising the floor and tying future increases automatically to inflation. Workers are winning ballot initiatives, and even employers are recognizing that raising wages helps them attract and retain the people they need. But that's really what this event is about. It's about why we need to raise the minimum wage in the country, but also what strategies are working to build them. And also learning from state experience that these wage increases are still allowing communities to grow and grow robustly. Just doing so, that growth is reaching everyone, not just a few. So we really have an extraordinary group of voices here. In a moment, I'll turn it over to Arin Dube, the Provost Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and author of the forthcoming book, The Wage Standard: What's Wrong in the Labor Market and How to Fix It. Arin was an incredible leader in the Biden administration on labor policy, and I'm really excited about his new book. He's one of the leading researchers in the country on wage policy, and his remarks, I think, will be really spot on today. After that, we'll hear from leaders who can speak to what's working on the ground in Nebraska, Missouri, and Los Angeles. And they will speak to what we all feel in our own lives, how lowering costs is necessary, but isn't enough, and that the dignity of work is a central part of what makes us, what makes us American, what makes us feel optimistic about the future. And when wages are stuck, and when it's really hard for wages to move up, workers can also be increasingly pessimistic. So it's our view that to ensure that we are supporting a stronger economy, we need to ensure that we're lowering costs and increasing wages, and that these go hand in hand to create a vibrant economy for the middle class and people struggling to get into the middle class as well. So let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dube.
Hi, Neera. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, Neera, and thank you, Center for American Progress, for doing this. is really an important issue, and great to see so much interest. So I want to start with a tale of two cities. In 2023, two fast food workers, one in Tucson, Arizona, and one in San Antonio, Texas, were doing about the same job. These are two cities with roughly similar cost of living, similar overall wages, but the Tucson fast food worker earned $14 an hour, San Antonio worker around $12. That's about $4,000 a year, more than a year's worth of basic food costs. So what explains it? Productivity? Skills? No, really one thing: policy. Arizona voters passed a ballot initiative to raise the state minimum wage. Texas did not, and it stayed with the federal $7.25 an hour. In 2015, the Tucson worker was actually earning a little bit less, but by 2023, she earned 15% more. So policy really flipped the script. Now, this comparison really is a window into a bigger story. Since 1980, the American economy has grown enormously. Productivity, output per hour of work, rose 73%, but wages at the 10th percentile rose only 17%. The median, 23%. Before 1980, wages and productivity moved together for about 30 years, but after 1980, that link broke. Now, this was not inevitable. It was a result of choices, policy choices, corporate choices, and institutional erosion. And those are choices that can be unmade. Why did this happen? So one part of the answer is employer market power. Economists have a funny name for it. It's called monopsony. But the idea is pretty straightforward. In a standard textbook model of supply and demand, if a firm underpays, workers leave. But in the real world, switching jobs is costly. A new commute, disrupted schedules, the risk of a bad boss. So employers can pay well below what a competitive market would deliver and keep most of their workforce. It turns out that if a company pays about 10% less, in normal times it sees about 2% higher quits. That's just not strong enough to make the market work well enough for most of us. Just to give you another example, FedEx and UPS do essentially the same thing, but 63% of UPS workers earn over $20 an hour versus 40% at FedEx. Another example, Target pays about 25% more than Walmart. Same industry, same work, but the difference is what each company chose to pay. Those choices, and this is important, are shaped by policy, pressure, norms. When unions are strong and when labor markets are tight and the wage floors are set, employers share more. When those forces are weak, they do not. And that divergence is a consequence of the negotiating environment, and we can change it. So that's what my book, The Wage Standard, really is all about. We rightly focus on bringing costs down, but wages have been neglected for 40 years. We can't solve the affordability crisis without also addressing that side of the equation. So what do we do about it? In the book, I argue there are sort of three broad levers, three-legged stool for raising wages, as it were. The first leg is full employment. When labor markets are tight and employers have to compete for workers, wages tend to rise, especially in the middle and the bottom. In the late 1990s boom, the late 2010s, and the years right after the pandemic showed this dramatically. If you erased just those 10 years from US economic history, real wages at the bottom or the middle would show essentially zero real wage growth since 1980. So full employment is not a bonus for most workers. It's a very important part of the game. Now, this is primarily a federal lever, monetary and fiscal policy, encouragingly, we have actually spent more time near full employment in the last 10 years than in 40 before, but that remains to be seen where we go with that. But at the end of the day, full employment alone is not enough. It comes and goes with the business cycle, so you need also durable standards. And that brings us to the second leg, and this is where state and local action is so decisive. Let's start with the minimum wage. The federal floor, as Neera said, has been about $7.25 since 2009. That's a long time. Adjusted for inflation, it's lost over a third of its value since its peak in 1968. But states and cities have not waited. 30 states and dozens of cities have raised their minimum wage above the federal floor, and the evidence of what that has done is pretty clear. So this figure comes from a study I did with co-authors using pairs of counties straddling across state borders. One side raised the minimum wage, the other did not. Similar local economy, similar labor pool. After these major increases between 1990 and 2019, restaurant earnings, the low-wage sector, rose substantially by about 6% more on the side that raised the wage. Employment continued growing at the same rate on both sides, no job losses. And this isn't just one study. A synthesis of 58 US studies that I talk about in the book finds a median employment effect that's pretty close to zero. Workers keep roughly 90 cents on every dollar of wage gains from minimum wage hikes. And the most credible studies often show even more positive results. There's also not just a blue state phenomenon. Ballot initiatives win in red, purple, and blue states. And these policies have made a difference even with federal inaction. The share of low-wage work actually has fallen from 25% in 2013 to about 20% in 2023. So that's the real testament to the work being done at the state and local levels. How far can we go? The next figure shows each state's minimum wage against a particular benchmark. And that benchmark that I'm using here is 2/3 of the median wage. It's one that some peer countries like the United Kingdom have adopted. And I argue that it's a good target for us to think about. The dashed line is where the minimum wage equals 2/3 of the median. What's really telling is that almost every state falls below it, even states with more ambitious policies. Of course, the federal minimum sits at 29% of the national median, the lowest across the OECD countries. But 2/3 of the median is still a goal that states have some ways to go. But minimum wages, even ambitious ones, do have a ceiling. They're designed for the bottom of the pay scale, but what about the middle? That's where sectoral wage standards can come in, and this is a frontier. Imagine all jobs had to pay a certain level. Employers can pay more than that, but no less. Now, if that strikes you as just a radical proposal, consider this. Many of our high-income peer countries exactly set a standard like that, either through national collective bargaining or by law. This figure shows what would happen to wages in America if we were to set sectoral standards like that, by type of job, by state. Of course, you raise the wage at the bottom, but there are also gains, even substantial ones, in the middle. And this is really the key. Setting sectoral wage standards like this can help rebuild the middle class besides lifting up the floor. Interestingly, California has passed a $25 standard for 500,000 healthcare workers. Minnesota established a nursing home wage board targeting about $23 by 2027. These are locally rooted jobs, middle-paying jobs, not exposed to global competition. This makes them an ideal place to start. Organizing and wage standards can reinforce each other. The California and Minnesota wage standards emerged from worker advocacy. Tight labor markets made organizing safer. Policy created the framework, and workers filled in the power. So the three legs hold each other up. So the federal minimum wage may be frozen, but the wage standard is not. Communities across America are proving we don't have to wait for Washington. We're going to hear a lot more about this today. We can raise wages now with tools that exist, backed by evidence that they work. I've written about all this, the wage standard, what's wrong in the labor market and how to fix it. It comes out next week, and I hope you'll check it out. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you.
Thanks so much to Professor Dube for sharing this diagnosis of what's wrong with the labor market. I think that was a really great orientation to the problems we're going to be talking about today. And he exactly queued up the stories we're going to hear now, which are tales from on the ground, and how communities across the country are looking at 725 federally and realizing that it's not enough, but they can take matters into their own hands. I'm Lily Roberts. I'm the managing director of the Center for American Progress's economic policy team. So now that we know exactly what went wrong, we're going to hear some ideas about how to rectify it. Every day, as Professor Dube shared, we set a new record for the longest we've gone without raising the federal minimum wage since it was created in 1938. We're to the point where 725, which wasn't a living wage even back in 2009, is now really just a punchline. I don't know if people saw, but actually there's a meme going around this week that in Pennsylvania, minimum wage is still $7.25, but a soft pretzel from Auntie Anne's will set you back $7.29, meaning that someone's hour of labor is now worth less than the pretzel you get at the mall. I think that we're just going to see more and more of this as costs continue to rise, and $7.25 falls further and further behind what people need to make. But given federal inaction, voters and workers are taking matters into their own hands. So we're going to hear from three amazing panelists today who will tell the story of their communities working for the wages they deserve. I'll briefly introduce each of them here. Then we'll dive into a couple of questions, and I encourage the audience to use the Zoom Q&A function for questions. We would love to hear your questions. I know there will be a lot, and then I will use the last 15 minutes of our time together to get to those audience questions. So again, please feel free as folks are talking to use that Zoom Q&A function. So first up, Mevy Mead has over 30 years building power in Missouri, 30 years experience building power in Missouri and nationwide. In her current position as Director of Strategic Partnerships with Missouri Jobs with Justice, Mevy is building upon the successful coalition which supported Missourians for Healthy Families and Fair Wages, Proposition A, a campaign that passed in November 2024 with 57% of Missouri voters in support. This campaign brought the minimum wage to $15 an hour this year. However, the Missouri State Legislature repealed a key portion of 2024's ballot initiative, which we'll talk about later. Becky Gould is the executive director at Nebraska Appleseed, a nonprofit advocacy organization that fights for justice and opportunity for all Nebraskans. Appleseed takes a systemic approach to complex issues like child welfare, immigration policy, affordable health care, and poverty, and they take their work wherever they can do the most good, in the courthouse, at the Capitol, or in the community. Becky's work was instrumental in Nebraska's 2022 ballot initiative, also to raise the minimum wage to $15 and to tie future increases to inflation. Finally, Kurt Peterson is a longtime advocate for labor and is the co-president of Unite Here Local 11. Unite Here Local 11 represents over 32,000 workers employed in hotels, restaurants, airports, sports arenas, and convention centers in Southern California and Arizona. They're at the heart of campaigns for better wages and working conditions, gaining nationwide attention for the Olympic wage campaign. The state of California has a minimum wage of $16.90, but cities, occupations, sectors, and workers are pushing well beyond that as they contend with high cost of living and a tourism sector that will drive the World Cup, the 2027 Super Bowl, and the 2028 Olympics. So without further ado, we're going to hear from our panelists. Mevi, I'm going to start with you. So right now, the buzzword for everyone is affordability. We're hearing about policy ideas to make housing more affordable. Communities are grappling with the cost of healthcare premiums, gas, groceries. How do you think about wages and paychecks as part of that affordability conversation?
Thanks so much, Lily, and the Center for putting this together. Arin, brilliant analysis there. So really, really happy to be here. Yeah, so Mevi from Missouri. And how do I think about it? I think brilliant colleagues at the Economic Policy Institute gave me this sort of tagline of thinking about affordability, which is, in the name of this panel, the flip side of affordability, wages. So it's a race between prices and wages, and where they collide is affordability. And I think the wage part is sort of often the silent partner. So I appreciate this panel and Arin's book for lifting that up. It was super obvious to us at Missouri Jobs with Justice. We're a coalition over 100 organizations. When we talk to our member organizations, our leaders, workers, all around, when we talked about what can we do to improve things in Missouri next through our ballot initiative process, we are one of over half the states, or just under half the states, that have the access to the direct democracy to take up policy and to win concrete improvements in people's lives when our politicians will not. And when we were looking to see how we continue to build political power in Missouri through that, the wage piece and the total compensation, which is why our measure also included bringing paid sick.
Hi, everyone. It looks like we've lost Mevi for just a minute, so I'm going to hope that we get her back quite soon. But in the meantime, I'm going to kick things over to Kurt. So, Kurt, the Olympic wage campaign hasn't been just one fight. It's involved strikes and walkouts, city ordinances, campaigning to defeat a ballot initiative, to overturn a victory, and solidarity across an industry and occupations. What tactics have been consistent in the fight, and what has changed? And how do you think that plays into how the whole LA area, not just the workers, not just the employers, think about wages and affordability differently than it did when the campaign began? Oh, Kurt, I think you're on mute.
We're like a technical disaster here. We're good organizers, but we're not very good with Zoom. So I apologize for that. So anyway, thanks again for putting this on and for putting us together. So and thank you, Arin, for that presentation. When we talk to our members who are cooks and servers and bartenders and dishwashers in hotels and in stadiums and at the airport, over what their number 1, 2, and 3 issue is and was, it's housing, and how are they going to afford to pay the rent? And of course, part of that solution is more housing, but the other part is paying a living wage so that they can afford to do so with one job. And so when we launched our Olympic and Paralympic wage campaign several years ago, it came out of that necessity. And it also came at the time when we were bargaining over 100 hotel contracts in the city of Los Angeles. And we decided that was going to be a major fight, was to raise wages significantly in our contract fight. And we also decided that we needed a policy component alongside in order to make sure that the bottom feeder hotels and other industries, including the airport, would pay a living wage. And but it was born out of this idea that workers just simply can't afford to pay rent, and that we believe that those who teach and act and cook and clean in the city of Los Angeles ought to be able to live near where they work, which used to be the case and no longer is. So we started striking our hotels with this idea. At the same time, the writers were on strike, so we joined them, and it was the same chorus. They can't afford to live in Los Angeles. So eventually, everyone kind of had that message, and that it was summer of strikes here in Los Angeles. We won a spectacular agreement, but we hadn't yet won the Olympic and Paralympic wage. And finally, we were able to pass it. And shortly thereafter, the industry spent $8 million to try to referendize that initiative in order to, or excuse me, that wage in order to put it on the ballot. So that voters would have to vote for it. We, successfully pushed that or defeated that because we had over 100,000 Angelenos sign revocations of their signatures that would have put this initiative, or excuse me, this wage on the ballot. And but that didn't end it. They continue to fight. What it's become, honestly, is a war between big business, between Delta and Airbnb and hotel industry against working people in the city of Los Angeles. It's really never going to end, whether it's the Olympic and Paralympic wage or how businesses are taxed. We're now in a war with them, and it's pure class warfare in Los Angeles, and we believe that we will prevail. But right now, the wages will get to $30 by 2028 before the Olympics, along with a healthcare credit of almost $10. So it would be a $40 minimum for hotel and airport workers, but they're not done. They have made it very clear that they're going to fight us every step of the way. And the good news is, Angelenos are in favor of our fight, and so are our members. And they're ready to do whatever it takes, including a strike, to make sure it happens.
So often in conversations about raising wages, the idea comes up that some parts of the country are cheaper to live in than others. So those cheaper places must not need high wages. And, I think we're sort of straddling the balance of we hear from Kurt about $30 in Los Angeles. We need those leaders in those high cost of living areas to be really pushing, and workers are advocating in those very expensive parts of the country for their own wages and for their healthcare needs as well. But if we stick with that as the theory, then anywhere that's not New York City or LA doesn't need or can't afford whatever wage you're talking about. And we know that that's just not true. There's nowhere in the country that $7.25, the current federal minimum wage, as we know, is anywhere close to a living wage. So Becky, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the need for economic justice in Nebraska. That's a place where, if you talk to a policymaker from LA or New York, they might assume that Nebraska doesn't need or can't afford higher wages. How do you think about that issue, and how does the idea of cost of living play into your work?
Yeah. Thanks, Lily. Thanks, Cap, for having me. And, I think it's a fair point to talk about cost of living because it is different. But cost of living has to live in a context of what are the actual costs, right? You can't just say, well, cost of living is lower, so that means by default, whatever your minimum wage is now is fine. And I think sometimes that's how the conversation goes. But for, the communities that we work with here in Nebraska, it was evident that there had been a minimum wage campaign in 2014 to raise the minimum wage to $9 an hour. And once we hit that mark, certainly that was making a difference for folks. But when you look at what is a living wage in Nebraska for a household of one, the MIT living wage calculator tells us that to be able to afford housing, childcare, food, all of the things that you need, a single individual needs to make $21.75 an hour. And so even though we had an increase to $9 an hour, we were still nowhere close to what people needed to be able to make ends meet. And we like to talk about wages in the context of not just a living wage. We don't want people to just survive. We want people to be able to thrive. And that means having,
an income that's at a level where you can comfortably afford what you need. You can put some money away for your future. You can have a little bit of a security blanket should something happen. And that means having a wage that isn't just, you're at zero at the end of the month. And so as we were, talking about what could we do in Nebraska, it was a revisiting of the ballot initiative strategy as a way to get the wages up above $9 an hour. And we have a unique legislature. If you're not familiar with Nebraska, we have a one house, a unicameral legislature. And we did start there and brought legislation to try to raise the wage. But it ran into the same kind of policy debate challenges that I think it's run into at the federal level and in many other places around the country. And so, the workers that we work with and the coalition partners all decided, we should go back to the ballot because Nebraskans are really feeling the challenges of low wages. The data on Nebraskans work incredibly hard. We have very high labor force participation. We have one of the highest rates of multiple job holders. We have one of the highest rates of women in the workforce. So as you look at all of those measures, Nebraskans are working incredibly hard, yet we have a pretty steady rate of child poverty. And folks really aren't progressing. And so we worked with groups to design a policy to raise Nebraska's minimum wage from $9 an hour to $15 an hour. And then it included a provision to index to inflation. And I think, as we were talking with workers and we were talking with employers and small businesses about this campaign, there was, pretty strong recognition that, even getting to $15 an hour was not going to do it for most folks. And that there were still going to be needs. And I think it's part of why the indexing provision was important, but also, just really recognizing that the minimum wage is not, even at this level, going to be what people need. And so I think, again, back to the question of cost of living, it is fair, right? It's cheaper to live in Nebraska than it is to live in California. But we still need wages that reflect that actual cost of living. And certainly the federal minimum wage isn't anywhere close to what's needed.
Thanks, Becky. I'm going to come back to a couple of those questions, I think, in the audience section, because I'm getting a preview of some of our audience questions. Just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, please do use the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom. But Kurt, back to you for a second. So can you talk a little bit, your work is focused on a lot of different policy goals and sort of things that workers need in their lives. Can you talk about sort of how campaigns for higher wages build worker power? So bigger paychecks are obviously really important. That's the goal of a campaign many times. But how do jobs and lives and communities change beyond sort of just bigger paychecks when they want a better deal for themselves?
Mm-hmm. I want to comment on something that Becky said first, if I might, and that is that even though LA is supposedly a progressive bastion and we're passing all these wages, it took us over 2 years to pass the Olympic and Paralympic wage. Our members have decided we're kind of done, even in LA, of passing legislation and policy through the council. We're better off when workers write and then go collect signatures and put on the ballot something that actually they want. It turns out to be faster, and workers, one way of building power is to have workers knocking on doors who are passionate about the issue, collecting signatures and then getting on the ballot. So I agree with Becky that I'm kind of, we don't need legislation that gets sliced and diced and takes 2.5 years to be passed. And that happens in LA. Imagine how hard it is in places where, allegedly there isn't that progressive pro-worker policy. And the other thing I'd say about the wages, which, and this bears out in every poll that we do, the only thing that polls higher than raising wages is belief in God. No matter if you're Nebraska or LA, this thing polls out of sight. People believe it in their bones. Even rich people know it's true. And so when we get it on the ballot, it wins. And so we should feel really, strong about that. And in terms of building power, look, this is a tool. policy in we do it to build power for working people, just like the boss uses it to build power for their wealthy industries and CEOs. So it isn't a success if we pass a policy but we don't win more members into our union or have people more interested in organizing. I'm not into the manna from heaven, suddenly people get money from something they don't know where it came from. That doesn't build power in our experience. So therefore, when we drive something, we have workers behind it. We have our union behind it. We try to get other labor unions behind it. And then when we win it, it's our job to explain to people where it came from and that this is only a taste of what they could get, that actually the real power is by building a union, a worker organization in your shop, because that is, as we all know, the way that workers actually transform their work and their lives. So, and we passed many, many policies. I mean, one policy we passed was during the pandemic, all of our members got fired, but so did all the members in non-union places. So we passed right to return to work legislation because that enabled people to go back into their shops and keep their jobs and keep organizing where we were organizing before the pandemic. So always with us, it's an eye on how does this help us build power for working people, both in our industries and in the city, and they all build on each other, right? We pass one thing, then someone else has an idea, and it's great. Right now we want to get $30 an hour for every worker in Los Angeles. The boss says he's going to go after us and try to take away for hotel workers and airport workers. Fine, we'll double down and let's go there. So we have an initiative that we're circulating that does exactly that ahead of the Olympics. So that's building power has to be the end here for working people in any kind of policy that we do.
Thanks, Kurt. So one more question for Becky here. So we've hinted at this in both the sections with Mevi and with you, Becky, because both Nebraska and Missouri attempted to, both increase the minimum wage itself and then tie future increases automatically to inflation. And we'll talk a little bit about what's happened in both of those cases. But first, Becky, I'm hoping, can you talk a little bit about how that advocacy for sort of a wonky provision, right? Like your wages will keep going up in the future. It's tied to this sort of external calculation of what's going on in the economy. You won't really know how it's working until it's implemented. Can you talk a little bit about how that played into a campaign and how advocates talked about that in a way that resonated with workers, employers, and with policymakers?
Yeah, I think there were a few things that were really important context for the campaign. So this campaign was playing out in 2021, 2022. So this is as our country is really grappling with the highest inflation people had seen, and so people were living it. And when you would go to someone's door with the petition, and I did a lot of signature collection with our team out in small rural communities, and you'd go to the door and you would explain, and of course people do understand the minimum wage right away. And then it would say, and this has this provision that would make sure that the wage goes up with inflation over time. And because inflation was being talked about and people were feeling it and seeing it, and it made sense. And you didn't really have to explain it deeply or have much of a discussion about it, because people are like, yeah, the wage should go up with inflation, and help people be able to respond to rising prices when that's the dynamic that's going on around the country. And I think the disheartening thing is that our state legislators then came back and said Nebraskans really didn't understand, what indexing would mean and making sure the wage keeps pace with inflation, and they said this is complicated, and it's really not complicated, right? We see costs go up, wages should go up. And there's lots of places where we do index to inflation in public policy all the time, without discussion and without a concern that it's too complicated for people to understand. And so I think part of it is just one, trusting people, trusting voters, because they're living it and they do understand, and then really trying to kind of push through the business narrative that we ran into, and some of the elected officials' narrative around, well, this is wonky and complicated, and businesses need predictability, and this isn't predictability, and it's and I think that's another argument that is, a little tough to swallow, because I think most businesses are anticipating what they think the increase in inflation is going to be, and adjusting salaries, certainly for the higher end of their pay scale based on that on an annual basis. And so I think you have to, be willing to just sort of call things out. And I think one of the other strategies that we used throughout the campaign, we did work with a lot of small businesses. We had over 200 small businesses who endorsed the campaign. And, I think they understood that, paying their employees well brings stability to their workforce. And even in small towns, I remember talking to an owner of a small town cafe in one of the towns that we were collecting signatures in. And, they understood, well, if people in our town are making more, then they'll come to the diner more. And, I think it's the economics of it make sense. And they make sense to business owners as much as they make sense to workers. And so I think it's just sort of, diving into that conversation and really trusting that people's experience tells them what they need to know about how indexing works and why it's important.
That's great. So we've got Mevi back. So I really want to bring her back in. So Mevi, so automatic inflation indexing was part of Missouri's 2024 ballot measure as well, but that component was overturned by the state legislature last year, alongside paid sick leave and some other incredible victories for Missourians that had passed via ballot initiative. Can you talk about the impacts of the legislature's decision on Missouri's workers and sort of how you're moving forward?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay. So sorry, everybody. Yeah, wild. I'll try not to get into a conspiracy theory on why my internet went out during this presentation, but here's the phone. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, what I want to make a point about is the legislative pushback that we experienced in Missouri after having this amazing victory, not just in 2024, but we've been building power and using the direct democracy process for these concrete victories that Missourians are experiencing and appreciating, and it's making a difference in their lives. That what we did after talking to all the people I mentioned before my internet went out was grounded the Missourians for Healthy Families and Fair Wages campaign in a set of values that we were super transparent about, and it echoed throughout every little bit and big bits that we did for the campaign. Number one was that workers make the economy run. We are socialized in Missouri with this terrible business first orientation that is making people vote and act and behave against their self-interest. And we knew we needed to tackle that head on in this campaign. And with lots of support from some national foundations, local groups, research, intensive research, largely grounded in the South, is this notion of we can have a mind shift away from this business first orientation that people are socialized in Missouri and in many places in the South, to a worker-centered and a family-supporting economy. We proved that with this campaign of raising the wage, bringing these benefits, paid sick, and tying the wage increase, not freezing it, which we had actually done since 2010. So Missourians are used to having a wage that we've been raising slowly over time that is tied to the increases in the cost of living. But so that was our first value, that workers make the economy run. The second value was that those workers live in families, and when the workers and their families thrive, our local economies thrive. And that started to really make sense. And finally, our third value pillars was that we all know that some, not all, employers don't treat their employees fairly. They are not keeping up and they are mistreating. And that is where we need government and policy to come in with some common sense guardrails, like a minimum wage, like a requirement for paid sick, and like the tying of the wage to the future cost increases. The reason our legislature came so hard against this, and we did a law change intentionally, not a constitutional change, which is harder for the legislature to attack. They chose to attack it because they saw that powerful message making a huge political difference in the state. All of the entities that were led by the chamber, that led the elimination of paid sick, when they would testify, the legislatures would ask, well, does your company offer paid sick? Every single one of the lobbyists lobbying to remove the paid sick had to admit that, in fact, their employers did offer paid sick. It was not about the policy. It was not about any sort of sensible business interest that was opposed. It was a direct reaction to that power building, and especially that Kurt was talking about. These workers built too much power. We're going to knock them down. We're going to take away a benefit, and we're going to freeze those wages. It was a political message that we are receiving politically. And when you ask what we're doing about it, we are actively trying to defend our direct democracy process, which is under existential threat in this next election. So we must do that. Only then can we get to our future ambition and political power building for a workers' bill of rights. So that's what we're doing here in Missouri. And again, appreciate your patience with my technical issues.
Well, it was worth the wait. Thank you for the inspiring answer to that question, because I feel like it's really setting us up well to go over to some audience questions. The questions have been pouring in. I have never seen so many questions come in for an event like this. I think we have a lot from the tenor of questions we're getting. It seems like we have a lot of activists and policy folks and researchers from across the country who are all fighting for worker power, for higher wages, for more affordable communities. And I'm so excited that they are excited by what they've heard today. So one theme that I'm seeing in some of these questions, it sounds like many folks are writing from personal experience about having to contend with talking points from others or concerns or general worries that higher wages mean that small businesses and businesses in general will close. And I'm wondering, I see that Professor Dube is actually still on, so I'm wondering, he may have some thoughts here as well, but I'm wondering if each of you could share, maybe in just a sentence or two, the most sort of successful way you argue against that. So what's the point that you go to when you hear that worry? I run a small business, or what happens to small business? There's sort of the personal experience, and there's the I read in Econ 101 that small businesses might close version of this question. So would love to hear from each panelist about sort of what's the most resonant point that you bring to the table when you hear that concern. Kurt, maybe can we start with you?
Sure. I think it was mentioned before, but the money that goes into people's pockets through their wages stays in the community and doesn't go to corporate CEOs. That people get that. They care about their neighbors, that their neighbors are making money. Their neighbors are going to go to local grocery stores and local restaurants and local businesses. And we get lots of support from small businesses, just like Becky and Mevi were talking about, lots of support.
I also think there's something to be said about like business models. And, when you're creating the business model for your small business, the planning that goes into that should start with what are the wages that I need to pay my employees so that they can thrive in our community, and building your business model around that. And I think, I think when you think about the business community's narratives in other spaces, they're talking about, the sophistication at which they do lots of things. And to me, that's got to be part of the starting point. Don't we want businesses that treat people well? And at the end of the day, they're going to be more successful. And so, yeah, you should plan on the front end. If you're going to start a small business, you need to think about what are the wages that I need to pay so I can treat people well in my business. And that's going to help my business be successful long-term, help my community, and the folks that are living in it do well. And so, it's, I think that's a part that I don't hear people talking about. And it's a responsibility on the business side to think about your business model and how you can still be profitable and treat your employees with dignity.
I would just piggyback on what Becky and Kurt have said. We too had, hundreds or 600 small businesses sign on in support of the measure. And I would say that what worked for us was kind of a 1-2, state the facts. We have evidence in Missouri, and lots of smarty pants people on this call have evidence across the country that simply it's not true that the rise in the wages drives out. There are lots of other factors. Everybody knows small businesses can be hard to keep afloat, and it's not the wage. You can't isolate for it. It's just not true. But we all know that if we were winning on the facts, we'd be done. We'd have a great federal minimum wage. That's not what things are. So I would say it's state the fact, call it out. It's not true, which is really fun. And then like I'm presenting to an economics class where the students are all saying this is what we learned, to your point, Lily. Anyway, so you state the fact, and then secondly, go back to the humanity of it. Like, we had all these businesses and anticipated in Missouri in our campaign in 2024 that they would be our most compelling messengers, because we know that the business argument was going to be the one that they put the money behind. In fact, our research, we did really detailed research and learned from voters that the businesses were nice. They didn't mind that messaging, but the messages that really moved voters, and we had over 500,000 Trump voters vote to raise the wage and bring paid sick day. It was the people's story. It was that point that workers make our economy run. To what Kurt was saying, everybody gets that, but they need to be reminded that when there's more money in those family pockets, that money stays in our community. It doesn't go for, layaway on a yacht. It goes into the local businesses. And that's the place I would like, I know this is a very factual graft loving group, but these stories tied with those facts are how we were successful in Missouri and will continue to try to be.
That's great. So another theme that I'm seeing in the questions is sort of the intersection of wage and sort of your long-term financial stability. So someone actually wrote in with a personal story saying that they're a volunteer who helps prepare tax returns, and they often work with older people in their 80s and 90s who earned a very low wage, even the minimum wage, but 60 years ago. Which leads to a lower Social Security amount now. It's never going to be enough for somebody who's trying to not work in their 80s. It sort of locks in over time. And other folks are talking about, if minimum wage stays so low, how does anyone afford childcare so that they can then go to work? All of these trade-offs that you have to make and that really lead to a life cycle of low wage work and being sort of stuck in poverty. I'm wondering if you all could sort of touch briefly on whether there were any surprising intersections of policy for you, folks coming out of the, any sort of advocacy groups or communities who really sort of stepped in to talk about why minimum wage or low wages in general was such a problem in their life, and sort of how you incorporated that into the work that you do. Kurt, you mentioned the healthcare provision. Maybe that's a place to start.
So, yeah, we've passed a number of minimum wage ordinances with a healthcare component or minimum that employers have to fulfill in order to enable employees to have affordable health insurance, because there is, the bosses, we all know this. We pass these ordinances. They always find ways to, make it more difficult for workers to get that money. And sometimes they do it by, decreasing the amount that they were providing for around healthcare, or they cut hours, and they do these things. They do them anyway. So I don't think we should say there's a cause here between wages and raising the wages and what they do. But one way that we've been able to sort of push back on one front that we saw the employer try to play games around is to create a healthcare credit so that workers not only would get wages, but also healthcare, which again, like when you talk to people, anybody, they're like, of course, corporations, companies need to be doing that. So yeah, that's one example of how we've tried to, balance the wage with other needs that workers have.
I would argue that we were able in Missouri to tap in, our slogan for Missouri is the show me state. And there's a deep sense of community that often is actually intentionally by politicians and leaders who benefit from dividing Missourians when we have a whole lot more in common. And there is a huge majority of us that have more in common. So we tried to tap into that and tell stories about what the suppressed wage in Missouri was costing families and the lack of the ability to take care of a sick kid. So there's this amazing story from a worker who didn't have paid sick. They were in fast food was their career. So they were getting low wages and no benefits. And this Marion tells a story about how her kid finally asked her after a few times when the kid was sick and she couldn't stay home, said, "Do you not love me, Mom? Like, why can't you take care of me when I'm not sick?" And of course, that's a hard thing to explain to a kid, the whole economic cycle. But that story really moved people to think about, this isn't just about me and my wages or what the business message is. This is really about my neighbors. And I don't know how well we really tapped into that longevity question. Like, if you're locked in at a low wage, that's going to be forever and ever. I think more people are like, do I have, can I afford a $200 surprise bill? No, but like Becky was talking about, if I had a living or a thriving wage, I could put some money aside for that. And I think that flows into that longer term economic picture. But I would say that, again, those stories and tapping into a people's sense of community and what is going to make their community and their local economy thrive was something that seemed to work for us.
Becky, do you have anything to add? I know you work on many issues at Appleseed, but are there surprising or areas of intersection between policies that you work on and this question of wages?
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work on public benefits programs. And the reality is that public benefits programs subsidize low wages. The child care subsidy program is one example of how, folks end up affording childcare when their wages are low. And the SNAP program as well, Medicaid, all of those programs are stepping in to fill the gap of low wages. And even when those programs step in to help, folks are still, the income to qualify for those programs is so low that no one is in a position where they are yet building that kind of cushion or safety net for themselves down the road. And so I do think it's important that we tie these things together, especially as we are, in a moment of shifts and changes in some of these key safety net programs that are trying to tie access to those programs even more to work, with this idea that somehow that is going to lift people out of poverty. And the truth is that, folks who can work and can find a job and can make it happen are doing that, and tying in these work requirements even more to public benefits programs is designed to move people off of those programs, not because they're finding work, but because we've created a complex administrative web that at the end of the day, if you're working two jobs and trying to take care of kids and you are trying to navigate these complex public benefit systems, it's overwhelming. And it doesn't need to be. We could streamline lots of things and make it easier for people. So I think just as we're talking about, tying wages and affordability, I think we also have to think about how our public benefits programs are related here and really a subsidy to businesses for paying low wages. And that means the business community has got to be coming to the table more in helping to either help support these safety net programs that help subsidize the workforce, or raising wages so those programs become unnecessary.
Well, that's a great way to tie together all of our themes for our closing here. We've hit 3 o'clock. I'm so grateful to our panelists, to Arin Dube, who gave us our sort of great econ. Well, I don't know if that was Econ 101, but maybe that was Econ 102 lecture to kick us off this afternoon. I hope you'll all check out his book, which I think is linked in the event invitation today. But I'm so grateful to our panelists for joining. I think that, while those of us who spend most of our energy on the federal side bemoan the lack of momentum that we have on getting past 725, we're going to continue to take inspiration from folks around the country who are doing great work to raise wages for millions and millions of workers. They're not stopping at 15. They're going further and further. And it's so important for driving an economy that works for people. I think that, our next conversation will be how can the federal side learn from you all and what can we do next? I really appreciate everyone who's joined this afternoon. I'm glad we were able to get to some of our questions, and thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.